From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Joe Biden's campaign launches a $50 million ad buy following a big fundraising weekend, while a new poll shows independents turning from Trump after his conviction. We'll have more on the state of the presidential race with Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia.
Vladimir Putin heads to North Korea for the first time in 24 years amid accusations Kim Jong-un's regime is supplying Russia with arms for its war in Ukraine. Melinda Harring of the Atlantic Council will join us with more on the significance of the visit.
And U.S. envoy Amos Hochstein is in the Middle East to ease tensions between Israel and Hezbollah as the IDF begins daily tactical pauses in fighting to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. It's the start of a new week, Joe, and once again we have our eyes both here at home on domestic politics and abroad as we saw a flurry of headlines pertaining to Israel over the weekend.
Yeah, where to begin? We're talking now about a daily pause here, a tactical pause, 11 hours each to allow humanitarian aid to get into at least areas of Gaza. We're looking at a war cabinet that's been dissolved. Enter Amos Hochstein, President Biden's energy advisor, dispatched to the Middle East in an attempt to avoid a war between Israel and Hezbollah. It's something that John Kirby spoke about today at the White House.
If we weren't concerned about the possibility of escalation and a full-blown second front there to the north, we wouldn't still be involved in such intense diplomacy. And Mr. Hochstein's over there right now. As a matter of fact, he's in Israel as we speak.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Dan Flatley. So, Dan, we've seen Antony Blinken make 8 trips to the Middle East since October 7th. Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, has been dispatched frequently as well. What does Amos Hochstein bring to the table in trying to make sure things don't further escalate or a new front not open?
Well, I think the administration is very much concerned about that northern border with Lebanon and the threat from Hezbollah there. And so I think Hochstein will bring his relationships in the region, obviously, as an energy advisor to these discussions. But really, they want to keep the tensions on that part of the fight as low as possible. And there's been some more activity there. So that is a very dangerous situation, especially when you consider that Hezbollah is really the enemy or the adversary that Israel is really concerned about in the region, even above and beyond Hamas. Mm-hmm. So it's a very delicate situation, to say the least.
Speaking of Hamas, what do we make of these tactical pauses we're seeing now for humanitarian aid to get into Gaza? We've heard words like famine describing the situation in Gaza. Is the Israeli government reacting to that now? What's the motivation?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things that are sort of all happening at the same time, obviously. You still have a continuation of military operations in that region of Gaza, although, as you said, Joe, there is this humanitarian pause or tactical pause, as the Israelis are calling it right now. Obviously, there is an effort to get more aid into that area because the world is watching, and, you know, we all see sort of the humanitarian situation there. At the same time, as we talked a little bit about before, you have Hezbollah in the north, and you need to keep, your eye on that as well. So what the Israelis are trying to do is to maintain the support that they have from the U.S. and their allies in a way that allows them to continue to fight on 2 fronts, at least now that we know about, not to mention the Iranian proxies and others who are active in the region. So it's a very delicate situation, especially with Benjamin Netanyahu sort of losing that war cabinet, as you mentioned earlier, and trying to keep support within the Israeli government for his leadership at this time.
So is tactical pause essentially a replacement for a temporary ceasefire? Is it an admission in some sense that agreement is not going to be one that is able to be reached in the near term?
It's semantics on a certain level, because I think, as Joe and I kind of talked a little bit about earlier, tactical pause is not a ceasefire. And I think the Israelis want to be clear that what they are doing here is only for a certain period of time, and it is a tactical pause in military operations rather than a formal ceasefire, either of a temporary or a permanent nature. So it gives them some breathing room in terms of being able to resume operations really at a moment's notice if they feel that they need to, or to potentially extend that tactical pause beyond what has been communicated at this point. So,
Dan, great to have you back at the table. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley with us on Balance of Power. We thank you. President Biden's campaign unveiling a $50 million ad buy to run this month in swing states around the country. The ad specifically targeting Donald Trump's character and his recent conviction. Here's a taste.
This election is between a convicted criminal who's only out for himself and a president who's fighting for your family.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief with her eye on the campaign trail, Julie Fine. It's great to have you back. The title for this ad is Character Matters. Does it?
Well, I think that is what the president wants to point out. He is really going to lean hard into this felony conviction of the former President Trump. Expect to see that at the debate coming up. If this is a tease of what that evening is going to be like, he's going to go after him for that specifically. But this is a very important campaign to him. It is a big issue here in this when we'll see him on television now in these ads moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and we also, in addition to the ad buy news and the message that they are bringing, simultaneously got new polling from Politico magazine and Ipsos pertaining to Trump's criminal conviction from last month that finds 21% of independents said the conviction makes them less likely to support Trump, and that would be an important factor in their vote. 21% is not an insignificant amount of people, Julie, in an election that is likely to be so close.
Exactly. This is a number that I'm sure the Biden campaign is very excited about. You're looking at 1 in 5 with the independent voter, which is really what many are going after in this race. I mean, listen, there is a group that is definitely going to vote for the former president. There's a group that is definitely going to vote for the president. So it is that independent voter that both are going after. If 1 in 5, this makes a huge difference to them, that's news that the Biden campaign will be very happy about.
What'd you think of the optics over the weekend, Julie? I've been asking different folks about this to get their impressions. Donald Trump is in Michigan. He was at a church, actually, asking black voters for their support, while Joe Biden was on a stage with Barack Obama, Jimmy Kimmel, at a massive fundraiser that pulled in over $20 million in one night. George Clooney was one of the hosts. As Joe Biden spends time with celebrity, does that help him against a Donald Trump who's with voters?
Well, I think what it helps him with is fundraising, which, again, is very important in this race. I mean, he's got these very big names, but it is not a big surprise that they are backing him. Donald Trump will talk about how he's the celebrity candidate, how Joe Biden is, and that Donald Trump is a person of the people. At the end of the day, they both need big money in this race, and President Biden pulled in more than $20 million.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Bloomberg's Julie Fine, our Texas bureau chief, thank you so much. Now coming up, we'll take a closer look at how President Biden and Donald Trump are preparing for next week's debate. The University of Virginia's Center for Politics director Larry Sabato will join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Let's talk about the love haters for a second. Those people who have a favorable view of one of the candidates and an unfavorable view of the others. As you point out, that's about 3/4 of the electorate, and their votes are already almost etched in granite. Amongst the love haters, they are with their candidate at the rate of about 95-1. Those folks are not going to switch.
This is Don Levy, director of the Siena College Research Institute, talking with us earlier on the early edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Next week, President Biden, Donald Trump hitting the debate stage in Atlanta. And so this is about to get real. Joining us now, Larry Sabato, the Center for Politics Director at the University of Virginia. Larry, welcome back to Bloomberg. Let's talk about double haters. Love haters, one thing. Double haters, we find twice as many than we had at this point in 2020. Those who say they do not like either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. They make up a quarter of the electorate, Larry. How do either of these candidates get to them next week in a debate?
Well, it won't be easy. And some of these double haters are not particularly information oriented. I think they'll be watching the debate. I don't know how much attention they'll be paying to it, but they may be one of the keys to the election. I kind of think so. You know, even Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016 only had double haters at 20%. So this really does set a modern record that a quarter of the electorate doesn't like either candidate.
Well, Larry, it begs the question as to whether or not, when we consider these demographics of voters, for example, like black voters, who the polling suggests are turning away from President Biden, if that means that they actually will therefore go cast a vote for Donald Trump, or just more likely not to participate in the process at all this time around. Is it really about whether or not double haters decide to turn out and cast any ballot, no matter who for?
Yeah, that's part of it. Their choices include the third party and independent candidates, and some will undoubtedly move in that direction. I think Cornel West and Kennedy, RFK Jr. would be the logical choices for black voters if they're not going to vote for Biden. The numbers for Trump are greatly exaggerated in these April, May, June polls. He's not going to come anywhere close to taking a quarter of the black vote. It's just absurd. But losing 2 or 3% of the black vote for Biden in a close election is the election. He's got to worry about blacks. He's got to worry about young people. He's got to worry about Hispanics. And even then, he's got to worry about turnout. Even if he gets the numbers back, he has to get them out to vote. So the onus right now is on Biden and the Biden campaign. The good news for him is, as I've said, it's mid-June.
Of course, it's the earliest we've seen a general election debate in some time, if not ever, Larry, and the optics there are going to be massive. This is a week from Thursday. We know the two candidates are preparing in their own ways. And Joe Biden will be up at Camp David for a number of days with Ron Klain and company, sparring and trying to prepare for this. But we talked to Celinda Lake about what to expect, the Democratic pollster I suspect you've had some opportunities to talk to over the years. Lake Research Partners, for what it's worth, had this to say about the potential impact of voters simply seeing Donald Trump in the act. Here's what she said.
I think also people don't like seeing Trump. His most effective ads are actually when he's not talking and not in them. And so I think that's one of the things of the debate. People will get to see Donald Trump again, and they're going to go, oh, my gosh, I had no idea he looked this old and he's this stooped and he's this crazy.
That's a Democratic pollster talking, Larry. Is there some truth to it?
Yes, there's some truth to it. If he goes off, he flies off the handle as he is wont to do, and starts trying to grab some time that isn't his, even though his mic will be turned off. I'm wondering how they arrange the audio in that studio to keep the other mic at the other candidate's podium from picking up some of what the other candidate is saying. Yes, there'll be some of that. You mentioned the preparation. Donald Trump doesn't have any preparation. He always says, I do it extemporaneously better. No question, Joe Biden is preparing. I hope somehow they get him to under-prepare rather than over-prepare, because he has a tendency to drown people in detail. That's not what people tune into a debate for.
There's also the question of who is going to tune in to the debate in general when we hear repeatedly, Joe and I, that not as many people, and Larry, I'm sure you get this too, are paying as much attention at this moment as we are, considering we are still nearly 5 months away from the election. But when we think about the different demographic groups who are likely to be listening, whether to the policy or just the performance, to see if the stamina is there, we talked about black voters. What about older voters? Because we have also seen polling to suggest, while Biden may be losing in some demographics, he's actually gaining traction with that one.
Yes, well, we older voters, because I'm over 70, we have less to do, and people don't invite us to parties as often. So we're at home watching news and public affairs programs, and we are very interested as a group in what's happening. So I think that group will be paying attention and will actually be listening, for the most part, to the substance of it. So that could be a plus for Biden, depending on how they handle this. And of course, you never know when a candidate is going to step in it. And there have been so many instances of that over the years. We don't need to review them now. But you mentioned the audience, and you're certainly correct that there will be millions who will end up voting who are not going to watch the first debate, at least not the first airing of it. Maybe they'll catch up later in the summer. You know, back when these started in 1960, a total of 70 million Americans watched all or most of the 4 debates between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. You know how many people voted in November? 70 million. There was almost an exact relationship there. I hope we're as lucky this time, even if we only have the 2 debates. It's important for people to get a sense of what these 2 will do now and how they're performing at their ages. They may think they know them. Well, you know, people change, and particularly at their age. They're going to be surprised at some of the changes they see in the candidates.
I need to ask you, Larry Sabato, about primary day in your own state of Virginia tomorrow. I could ask you about Oklahoma, but in your backyard is Bob Good, the Republican from Virginia, is now being challenged in a primary by not only the mainstream, if we can call it that, but Donald Trump himself backing John McGuire, who could upset Bob Good in this case. Does Donald Trump have the last say on this one?
He could easily, although I need to add, Bob Good has made a lot of enemies in a lot of different sectors of the Republican Party. So it isn't just the Trump people, but Trump has taken a special interest in defeating Bob Good. He just doesn't like him, and the people around Trump really don't like him either. He is difficult, let's put it that way. He's head of the Freedom Caucus. Of course, former Speaker McCarthy doesn't like him because he's one of the members of the Republican caucus who voted to oust McCarthy. So there are a lot of people involved in this, and most of them seem to be opposing Good. Now, to balance that, Good has the support of most of the evangelical community in this district, which is heavily evangelical in the rural parts. Charlottesville, where I am right now, is in this district, though it's the Democratic part of the district. The other parts are heavily Republican. The Republican nominee, even with this fierce disagreement, will be a heavy favorite in November. But there are a lot of observers in the Republican Party here, even some favoring Good, who think McGuire is actually going to win because of Trump. And Trump is doing an electronic event for McGuire tonight.
Well, we'll all be interested to see what happens tomorrow in the state of Virginia, Larry. I'm also interested in what ultimately could happen come November, because as recently as last week, when he was on Capitol Hill meeting with House Republicans, according to lawmakers who were in the room, they told me that he was talking about positive polls in Virginia. This is not the first time we've heard him suggest that Virginia may be a winnable state from him. Larry, is it really that purple?
No, I don't think he's going to win Virginia unless the Biden campaign collapses, and it usually doesn't for an incumbent president, Jimmy Carter being the main exception, in modern times at least. I don't think that Trump will win Virginia. The real question is it going to be close? Now, Biden is not going to win Virginia by 10 points the way he did in 2020. He's going to be lucky to win it by 5 points, which is what Hillary Clinton won by in 2016. But if this is a state that turns out in the polls and in reality to be even close, with Biden winning by only a couple points, we're going to have an early election night, and the election will be called for Trump early in the evening. I don't think that's likely to happen, but we're all surprised. And mid-June is not a good place to predict November elections.
That's pretty fascinating. That would require, though, for an implosion like that, to your point, Larry, for Joe Biden to lose Virginia, all of the Washington, D.C. suburbs, Northern Virginia, would just have to stay home in that world, right?
Yeah, there have to be a low turnout there. They're not going to vote for Trump, and they're heavily suburban, white suburban mainly. But white suburbanites, especially white suburbanites who are women, are very anti-Trump, and they're not going to go back to him. But it is a question of turnout. You can have an enormous rural turnout while you have mediocre suburban and urban turnout, which, by the way, is exactly what happened in 2021 when Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, won the Virginia governorship, the only victory Republicans have had in quite some time in Virginia.
All right, Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia, thank you so much for joining us. Now, coming up next, we're going to take a look at oil and how President Biden is thinking about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve ahead of the election. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Independent analysts have confirmed that drawdowns on the reserve so far have played a big role in bringing down oil prices, bringing them down. So we're going to continue to responsibly use that national asset.
That was President Biden back in 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the spike in oil prices that followed, where he revealed that drawdowns from oil reserves contributed to lowering those prices. Now, almost 2 years later, President Biden might be ready to reopen the U.S. oil stockpile, or the SPR, if there is another surge in gas prices. This is according to a new report in the Financial Times, in which Amos Hochstein, who is now actually in the Middle East, is quoted as saying, "We will do everything we can to make sure that the market is supplied well enough to ensure as low price as possible. I think we have enough in the SPR if it's necessary." It does, though, Joe, raise the question of the timing and whether this is all about making sure gas prices are down before November.
Well, that's true. The timing and the purpose here. If Amos Hochstein says that gas prices are still too high for many Americans, where's the emergency? The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is there to help in times of crisis, and an election does not qualify as a crisis. During a rally in Las Vegas earlier this month, Donald Trump had this to say about his plan for lowering the cost of gas and energy if he were to be reelected.
The second thing we're going to do about 5 minutes later, it doesn't take long, we're going to drill, baby, drill. We're going to get your energy costs in half. We're going to bring down your energy costs, and that includes New England.
New England, where heating oil remains a fact of life in the other half of the year. Drill, baby, drill. It's something, that brings us back to the John McCain convention, Kayleigh. But if we fast forward to 2024 under Joe Biden, we're pumping more oil than ever. Yeah, the U.S. is the biggest oil producer. That said, prices are still relatively elevated, WTI around $80 a barrel. But back when Russia first invaded Ukraine, remember, we were well north of 100, and that's when the tapping of the SPR really began. Well, coming up, speaking of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Biden met today with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg following last week's G7 summit in Italy. We'll talk about where the war stands now with Melinda Harring of the Atlantic Council, next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're not concerned about the trip. What we are concerned about, Trevor, is the deepening relationship between these two countries. Not just because of the impacts it's going to have on the Ukrainian people, because we know North Korean ballistic missiles are still being used to hit Ukrainian targets, but because there could be some reciprocity here that could affect security on the Korean Peninsula.
That was National Security Council spokesman John Kirby earlier today addressing the relationship between North Korea and Russia, following the news that Vladimir Putin is planning to visit the country this week. Joining us now is Melinda Harring, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Melinda, welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is the first time that Putin will have gone to North Korea since the year 2000. How concerned are you by this visit?
So, Kayleigh, I think it shows two things. I'm worried about a potentially deepening relationship between North Korea and Russia. You have to remember, Russia got 1 million shells from North Korea. And that was what enabled the Russians to keep pushing and pushing over the last 6 months when the Ukrainians didn't have enough ammo. So that's one thing that I would keep my eye on is, are they going to be cutting more deals to make sure that the Russians have enough shells? Two, I think it shows how isolated Vladimir Putin is. He doesn't have very many friends. He's got North Korea and he's got China and a few other people. So those are the sort of big takeaways that I see from this visit.
It's interesting, Melinda, when we talk about these old-fashioned mortar rounds, we found ourselves in a position where we don't make them like we used to, apparently, anymore in the U.S., and they're trying to ramp up production, in part to help with Ukraine. Can we deliver them as quickly as Russia seems to be getting them from other sources?
So, Joe, the answer to that is not really. It was very imperative that Congress gave the $61 billion package because the United States had ammo shells that no one else had. So we were able to provide the Ukrainians with shells for this urgent need to get them through the rest of 2024. But in terms, Europe is really far behind, and it's really slow, and it takes a long time to set up these processes. And the North Koreans have the shells, and they were able to supply Moscow right away. So it is a bit scary.
Well, as we consider the $60 billion that was approved by the U.S., knowing that at the G7 last week, member countries also agreed to the plan to use frozen Russian assets in order to provide Ukraine with a $50 billion loan. With both of those things combined, Melinda, how far can Ukraine get with that money before it's going to need more of it?
Kylie, Ukraine is going to need more money for weapons. The good news about this new package, the $50 billion, is that it can be used for military, it can be used for humanitarian, it can be used for budget support, and it can be used for reconstruction. So I like that it has that flexibility. But I suspect that Ukraine will need additional funds from the U.S. Congress in January of 25.
As we spend some time here considering the way forward and looking at this peace summit over the weekend, maybe you can shed some light on this. As Ukraine failed to win over a number of key nations from the global south, should this be a concern as this war is being prosecuted, or when Ukraine is rebuilding at a later date, or both?
So, Joe, I have a slightly different take on the Swiss Peace Conference. I see it as a big success for Ukraine. So let's step back a bit. We're more than 800 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, and it's natural for Ukraine to fade from the headlines. We also had a major war last October, so Israel and Gaza have been in the international headlines. So I see this peace conference as a way to remind the world that Ukraine is still the victim of Russian aggression and that this war is still ongoing. And in fact, this war got worse in May when Russia went into Kharkiv in the north again. So from that perspective, it's good because it's elevated the Ukrainian cause once again. And honestly, you have to dig in a little bit and look at who was there. So China was not there, and that made headlines, and that is worrisome. However, South Africa was there, and South Africa has changed over the last 800 days. At the outset of the war, they were much more inclined towards Moscow, and they're much more neutral now. And if you look at what happened at the actual summit, more than 80 countries signed on to Ukraine's vision of a peace plan. I would call that a success.
But to that point, though, 83 of 100 countries and organizations signed the communique. That is what we define as success here. What about the rest of them?
So, look, it's also a reminder. So Vladimir Putin thinks that the global south is his. So I think this conference is a reminder that Ukraine is contesting that Ukraine is working in the global south and making its arguments. Joe, I was in South Africa in April and trying to figure out how the global south sees the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And the issues that make sense to them are the kidnapping, Russia's kidnapping of children and Russia's abuse of grain. And those are the issues that I expect Ukraine to continue to push on, both in Africa and in Asia, to make progress. And I think it's slow but steady. Did this conference bring about world peace? No. No one thought it would, right? Neither side is willing to negotiate. But it reminded the world that Russia cannot get away with rewriting the international borders once again. And it reminded people of these ongoing issues of international justice that we can't look away from.
Well, and of course, there is a lot that NATO feels it can't look away from as they have this war so close to borders of NATO countries. We actually had President Biden meeting today at the White House with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and he had this to say.
Record number of allies meeting a NATO commitment to at least 2% of their GDP on defense. And in fact, the number is more than double since I took office, and I look forward to building it on all this progress next month when we have the 75th meeting here in Washington.
Melinda, when we look ahead to that NATO meeting in July, is there a deliverable you'd like to see when it comes from Ukraine after everything that we got out of the G7?
So, Kylie, to be real for a minute, I don't expect anything beyond pledges of assurance and maybe some more financial aid to come out of that big meeting in July. Ukraine is not going to be invited to join NATO, right? This is not what's at stake here. But I think Ukraine has to play for the long game. The Stoltenberg has said many times that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, but not now. So it's up to Ukraine to continue to reform its military and make itself interoperable. So when that moment is ripe politically, that Ukraine can march right in.
Ukraine's first round of formal talks to rework over $20 billion in debt. In the news today, Melinda, international debt ending without an agreement. How concerned are you about that?
So I'm not that concerned right now, Joe. It's still early days, but I'm not concerned because of that $50 billion package that we spoke about. That $50 billion package that the G7 pledged will close Ukraine's financing needs for 24. So we're in good shape if nothing else comes out.
Melinda, it's great to have you back. Melinda Harring with us on Balance of Power. We thank you. Coming up, President Biden hosting a fundraiser in Hollywood over the weekend, generating substantial funds for his campaign. We'll play this to the panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The next president is likely to have 2 new Supreme Court nominees. 2 more. He's already appointed 2 that have been very negative in terms of the rights of individuals. The idea that if he's reelected, he's going to appoint 2 more flying flags upside down.
That was President Biden in California on Saturday, where, of course, he had a big fundraiser alongside former President Barack Obama, George Clooney, Jimmy Kimmel, and raised almost $30 million. Joining us now with more is our political panel, Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, both here in our Washington, D.C. studios today.
Big deal.
A very special Monday indeed. And it was a very big weekend for Joe Biden. Jeanne, obviously, we heard him there making the arguments about what a second Donald Trump presidency would mean for the Supreme Court. He also, in a new $50 million ad buy, is making the argument of him versus a convicted felon, really seizing on Donald Trump's 34 felony convictions from several weeks ago. Which of these messages is most effective?
You know, I think that they have found, obviously, through internal polling, and we've actually seen some public polling with Ipsos and Politico, that you do have a chunk of voters for whom the conviction may matter. And so you hear them with a $50 million ad buy, all focused on character, talking about the fact that this is a convicted felon. And the message that I keep hearing is he's in it for him, to, you know, so he doesn't have to go to jail as it pertains to the economy and everything else. So I think that they have poll tested this and they feel like it is a message, and they're not waiting until the traditional time to drop this because, quite frankly, the polls are too tight for comfort. So they got to get this message out there now and hope to change a few minds in these swing states.
So George Clooney, Jimmy Kimmel, Julia Roberts, I guess in this say it out loud world that we're in now in politics, Democrats embrace celebrity and it works?
Sometimes. I'm generally not particularly
great
about using celebrities other than to attack them because Republicans don't generally have celebrities. But no, look, I mean, think about the constituencies, right? I would have said 2 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, that Democrats we're kind of counter-programming because celebrities and, rural, middle class, voters aren't that, impressed by Hollywood. They don't share the same common values and things like that. So nowadays, though, the Democratic Party is much more upwardly mobile. They're more, educated, more white, and frankly, more suburban, which would be, I think, kinder to a George Clooney and a Jimmy Kimmel than their previous base voter. So I guess it's in their self-interest because they raised tens of millions of dollars, and that's a good thing. But I'm not sure how many votes they're going to get out of this.
And of course, you have to go all the way to Hollywood to get this done, which is West Coast time. So you're 3 hours behind the East Coast. This is immediately following a trip to Italy for the G7, a trip to France just before that for the anniversary of D-Day. And all of this is a president who is an octogenarian and raises the energy question, something that Terry Haynes, Pangea policy founder, joined Bloomberg Surveillance earlier today to talk about.
Biden's got to show pretty much every day between now and November that he's up to the job and that he's kind of the saner, calmer alternative to Trump. That's the frame of the election to me, because then more people are likely to pull the lever for Biden, go the next yard if they get there. If they can't get there, then this election gets upended.
So he has to show he's up to the job, Rick, knowing that we have a debate on Thursday, and he's done all of this with his time in recent weeks. Does it have to be buckled down and prep now and conserve energy so you can perform on the 27th?
Yeah, I mean, I think that his team has got to lock him down and get him to focus and get him some rest, because that's a hard schedule for anybody of any age. And certainly if you're over the age of 80 and you're president, you've been having a busy year to begin with, enormous amount of stress in his life, both professionally and personally these days. He's just got to singularly focus on what's headed his way for the debate, and he's got to get rest, because Terry is right. The one thing people are going to grade him on is his competency, his capability, and if he appears sluggish or can't articulate a message, much like me today, then they're gonna check out on him, because when he wasn't campaigning earlier in the year, Donald Trump defined him as incompetent, as slow, as unhealthy. And they didn't push back on that. Now they're suffering those consequences.
What are the expectations for Trump? People expect something wild to happen. He can say whatever he wants. Maybe he's yelling while his microphone is turned off. Are there expectations, or is this a truly different game for these two?
I don't know. Stephen Miller said he's going to, knock it out of the ballpark. He's on some kind of energy high. He doesn't need to prepare, versus Joe Biden, who Rick just mentioned has very low expectations. So basically, if he goes up and says his name right, he's going to have, passed over this very low bar. But, we can't forget that it was the first debate of the last cycle that Donald Trump, he really, really stumbled. That was not a good debate for him. Traditionally, it's not for incumbent presidents. Now we have two incumbents, neither of whom had debated in many years. So it is going to be fascinating. But the rules are better for Joe Biden in this debate than they are for Donald Trump. But again, expectations low for Joe Biden. He has traditionally surmounted them, but we'll have to see.
Well, and of course, it's a question of what expectation is being set, to the point that Rick was just making, the idea that maybe it's not so much about policy as it is about performance. But if it is about policy for at least some voters, Jeanne, what is the most significant policy that Joe Biden has to convince Americans that his is the right one for?
He's got to focus on the economy. Bottom line, he has got to say that costs are too high, but I am the person to continue to move in the right direction. The other guy is all for himself and his billionaire friends. He also has to talk about freedom. He will ensure you have no more freedom, because he will put 2 more Supreme Court justices on who will take away your right to, IVF, contraception, and everything else. So those two.
A week from Thursday.
Yeah.
Counting down. Coming up with our panel, former President Trump's new plan. Meantime, to exempt tips from taxation could cost billions, it turns out. There are new numbers out today, and we'll play it to the panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It would require tariffs well over 100%. The impact would be to make life unaffordable for working class Americans.
That was Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, on ABC This Week. Just yesterday, joining us now, our political panel, Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital, is with us alongside Jeanne, Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. They're with us together at once in the same city. It's not always that this happens. Interesting numbers crunched today by the committee for a responsible federal budget. This is Maya McGinnis, who appears on this program from time to time and blew big holes last week in the idea of making the Trump tax cuts permanent. It would cost in excess of $4 trillion. Now she's looking at this new idea of making tips tax exempt. It turns out this, too, would be extremely expensive, somewhere in the area of $250 million. We're back to this question after Donald Trump met with the business community last week. Do CEOs care about deficits?
Yeah, CEOs care about deficits. They care about their businesses first, right? They're all under pressure to perform. And so things like what Donald Trump was talking to the Business Roundtable about last week of carving out the corporate tax rate from 21 to 20%. Yeah, that's a feel-good thing for them. That's okay. That also costs $250 billion.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is they also don't want to crater the economy. And they have to sell into an economy that is already price-sensitive because of higher inflation. When you start talking about a 100% tariff or a 60% tariff or even a 10% across-the-board tariff, you're talking about very inflationary economic moves. And that had the people at Business Roundtable very nervous because part of it was Donald Trump couldn't articulate a plan that he was going to do any of this specifically or how it was going to be paid for or what impact it was going to have on the Trump tax cuts that were passed in 2017 and will be expiring in 2025. Yeah. So it left a very unsettled group of people who are trying to manage large corporations, the largest corporations in America, in a way that I think spooked a lot of folks.
Well, it raises the question, Jeanne, as to whether or not we should consider this to be actual policy proposal that he would pursue if he wins the presidency a second time, or is he just throwing out ideas out at the wall and seeing if it sticks?
I think we have to take him seriously when he puts something forward like this, and these proposals are reckless. Maya McGinnis has talked about it. They haven't been scored by the CBO yet, but these are reckless proposals, and we just heard Janet Yellen talking about that. The idea that you would get rid of an income tax, what did Larry Summers call this? Like the single
worst macroeconomic idea in modern American history.
There we go. But I do think, to your point, it's such a good question. With all of these ideas that he throws out, we have to take them seriously. This is what he is talking about. Would they pass Congress? Let us all hope not. Now, talking about Congress, though, they have hardly been responsible with the budget either. But you just top this off. They're talking about, increasing spending. So this, where is all this money coming from? They have to be very clear, they beating the Trump campaign, and they have not been. So these ideas are reckless if they're not going to give us some clarity on what they would cost.
Well, outside of making this debate in Econ 101 class, is it not up to Joe Biden to connect the dots here? If you're worried about inflation, if prices are your problem, he's going to make it worse.
Yeah, obviously they've just invested $50 million in an attack on Donald Trump about being a criminal, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe their polling, as indicated by Jeanne earlier, suggests that that's a good approach. But I think this gives the Biden campaign a wonderful opening on a sensitive topic of the economy that he is already underperforming in to go after Trump. Because remember, if you can't improve your own standing, bring your opponent down to below you. And I think that has got to be the mantra for the Biden administration is right now they've got to look at Donald Trump and say, oh, he's given us this gift of all these reckless policies. Let's put that on TV.
Of course, speaking of what's on TV, it wasn't just a lot of discussion on the Sunday shows over the weekend about Trump's tax plans or tariff ideas. It was also a lot of people who are trying to be vice president who were out there on the Sunday shows. Jeanne, you could take your pick. Senator Tim Scott, Congressman Byron Donalds. Who's putting up the best performance right now as we await the reveal, either before or during the convention?
I like Senator Scott. I don't think he performs well in these Sunday show-style tough interviews. I think Byron Donalds is a very attractive young politician. My money has long been on Doug Burgum. But, I don't think we can forget the women. Elise Stefanik, she's a young mother. Donald Trump has to make up ground with women. To me, that is another person who could potentially be an asset to his team. But I don't know if he wants an asset in terms of votes or somebody who's going to do his bidding, unlike Mike Pence.
There's no list, right? We just have a list in the media. Donald Trump is going to end up picking the last person he talks to before the convention.
I don't know. I mean, my guess is the pick's already been made.
Yeah?
This is all just kind of hocus pocus. And I would say to all those guys, on the Sunday shows, I've been through a few vice presidential selections, and you only do damage to yourself by trying to audition on a Sunday show, right? I've never seen anybody go, wow, they did such a great job. Let's put them on the ticket. So save yourself some time.
All right. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino didn't have to audition to be here because this is our signature political panel, and we have them every Monday and Friday here on Bloomberg. And, of course, for more Washington coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
We'll see you back here tomorrow. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.